Okay, hi students. This is going to be our last lecture together, and I'm going to miss you guys. It's been a very interesting class. You guys have had some wonderful discussions on the discussion board. You have delved deeply into the reading questions, and I've become to kind of see what each of you are interested in most in exploring. And you delved deeply into the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which is a tough text, so good for you. A few housekeeping details. You'll have 2 readings this week. One by John Kabat-Zinn, one by Thich Nhat Hanh. You'll have reading questions for week 6, which is what this is. Those will be due on Sunday, October 27th. On Monday, October 28th, I'll put up your final exam. You'll be working on that individually. It'll be an essay exam, and you will email that to me. And I'll put that in the announcements today. But I wanted just to let you know that too. And today, I'm going to basically review the different types of Buddhism we've been looking at and go further into the Nikaya, into the Mahayana, into the Tibetan, and then into the place where Western Buddhism has taken hold. Okay, so to start out, we know that we have the Nikaya tradition, and it began, of course, with the birth of the Buddha. 485 BCE is a good term for that, good time point. We know that it was a monastic tradition, and that the ideal figure in this early monastic tradition was an arhat. An arhat, basically translated as saint in the Western world, was someone who had performed many lifetimes to become enlightened. And these guys, these arhats, were guys, almost exclusively, very few women, no lay people. So it was a very exclusive path. From there, some of the other interesting things about this period are that it was an iconic period. That means that there were no images of the Buddha during this period. There were a lot of depictions of the Jataka tales, or the early birth stories, that would be written out in all sorts of different places, and the pictorial representation of them were put on stupas, basically the big monuments, usually put up to possibly house a relic of the Buddha. But in those stupas, or on those stupas, you never found images of the Buddha during this early period. That's why it was aniconic, no icons. And the reason for this is that during this time period, you had a cultural expectation coming from Hinduism that everybody would be reincarnated. Given the fact that the early adherents of the Buddhist tradition, these monks and nuns, given the fact that they wanted to show that the Buddha had disappeared into nirvana, that he wasn't going to keep coming back, the way that they best demonstrated this was by the Buddha's absence. So you see very little, in fact you see none, icons of the Buddha during this period. So you have the star person being the arhat. Arhats, it was an exclusive path to be an arhat. It took a very long time. One of the most important values during this period was shila, which literally means discipline. Something that's interesting now is that in the mindfulness tradition as it is understood in the West, shila is most often translated as mindfulness. And I think, to be fair to the early tradition, the best way you understand that is that the Western Buddhists of today see the best thing you can do as a Buddhist is to be disciplined about your mindful practice. So that's really how that word came to be very important in the early period as discipline, and very important in this period now, in the current time period, as being a mindfulness discipline, having that kind of practice. We also, during this time period, had the production of the Pali Canon, the Tripitaka, the 3 baskets being the Sutra Pinaka, the Vinaya Pitaka, and the Abhidharma Pitaka. This is also the time period where you had the development of interdependent origination, that theory. In other words, these early Buddhists were trying to figure out why human beings suffer, why we are born into delusion. In that way, you can see this early period as being very cause-oriented. Why did we get like this? How did we get like this? And their understanding of how we got like that spelled out in the theory of interdependent origination, also sometimes called dependent causation. And that's where you arise and you were born into ignorance, and then all the other pieces develop from there. And where you have the development of the Four Noble Truths, again, looking at the cause of suffering, seeing that suffering is how we get to be attached to the things of this earth, and therefore reborn, and therefore not enlightened. And we see, of course, the development of the Eightfold Path. As we flow into the Mahayana period, which gets going in approximately 100 BCE with the production of these very, very, very early texts, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And during this period, you have icons all over the place. Now, the Lokottaravadins, one of the 18 sects, started to deify the Buddha, started to show that the Buddha was literally above the earth, Uttara Loka. So the Lokottaravadins were those who taught that the Buddha was Uttara, above the Loka. So their name embodies what they were talking about. And with the development of this idea that the Buddha was somehow supranormal, was a deified figure, this idea really pushes off into the Mahayana, where you don't just have the Buddha as something that is seen as a supernatural being, but you also have the development of a whole bunch of bodhisattvas that are seen as celestial beings. You also have the historical bodhisattva, and the ideal figure of the bodhisattva literally means one whose essence is enlightenment, sattva, essence, bodhi, enlightened one. And this bodhisattva ideal is very different than the arhat ideal. A bodhisattva is one who can choose to be reborn again and again, even though he or she reached enlightenment. They'll keep coming back in order to help every sentient being become enlightened. All right, so it was seen as the Mahayanists oftentimes turn around and say, oh, those Hinayanists, those of the little vehicle, those guys were very selfish. Their arhats got themselves enlightened, but they weren't about helping everybody get enlightened, and thus the importance of the bodhisattva to their purpose, because it allowed a much wider path, many more people who could become enlightened. So the bodhisattva that continuously comes back to help all sentient beings get enlightened, that's the new ideal. So you've got human beings that have a historical footprint on this earth as bodhisattvas, and then you have celestial bodhisattvas. Those who don't ever have a historical footprint, but somehow embody and communicate enlightened energy. Okay? And so you have icons all over the place. You have icons of the bodhisattvas. You have icons of the Buddha. So somehow these figures, through their supranormalness, are something that are accessible, and they need to be accessible. I always think that the Mahayanists just got to the point where they missed the Buddha. They wanted him back. They wanted depictions of him and proliferations of him in many ways, and that's what you see during this period. The bodhisattva ideal, as I referred to, is a much more inclusive ideal. Women could get there, men could be on that path, lay people like our friend Vimalakirti, right, can all be on that path. One of the ideal values of this time period is dana, or giving. And it speaks to the ideal that this early monastic community has grown like crazy during this time period. So not only do you have a lot more lay people involved, you've got a lot more monastics running around, and you need to set up a relationship where the lay people can support the monastics and the monastics support the lay people. And that was what this emphasis on dana, or giving, was about. Lay people help support the monastics with cough medicine and materials and money for libraries and all that kind of stuff. And monks and nuns during this period turn around and they help all people who want to be enlightened become enlightened. All right. And I'm still talking good? Okay. And so we've got a much more inclusive path, but the thing is, it still takes a really long time. Anybody who became enlightened during this period, became a bodhisattva, was also said to have had many, 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 many previous lifetimes to get there. Okay? During this period, you see an emphasis on emptiness. Things are no longer thought to have svabhava, or any inherent existence. Emptiness is what is. The absence of that which is false, is how the Tibetan Book of the Dead puts it, and I love that. You have an emphasis on upaya during this period, which means that we can tell the story any way. We can explain how the path works in any way that will help our listeners to get it. So skillful means, or upaya, is something that is put into the general workings of this institution. And you see this especially spelled out in the Lotus Sutra. And in the Lotus Sutra you see a synthesis happening. Okay, yes, there was the path of the Shravana, of the ascetic. There is the path of the Bodhisattva. There is the path of the Pratyeka Buddha, the one who gets enlightened on his own but doesn't teach others. But all these paths are really one path to enlightenment. And the Buddha just had the other ones because that's the only way people could hear it. It was the only way these kids would give up their toys and come running out of the burning house, which is the metaphor for what life is. And so there were all these various traditions, and the Buddhists of this time period wanted to synthesize them and also wanted to claim that there was only one path, and it's the path of the Bodhisattva. So that's what's going on during this period. We also saw during this period that you have a fork in the road. A fork in the road on one side, upholding a sense of duality. That the Pure Land Buddhas were out there, they're beyond me. As a result, they can pull me into the Pure Land, at which point I can become enlightened through my gratitude and my worship of these celestial Buddhas. And you have the path of non-dualism, which was followed by the Madhyamikas, the Tibetans, the Yogacharans, which said, all right, we may have all these figures out there, but really, they're not separate from me. This is enlightened energy that I am seeing, that is helpful to me, that I can visualize, because emptiness is a hard place to be. We're constantly being sold the idea that things exist solidly, and they don't. So being able to claim this enlightened energy and use this enlightened energy for your own meditative practice will help you get enlightened. Okay? Now the Tibetans did something very interesting. They said not only is the Bodhisattva path the way to go, and not only is this path non-dualistic, but everyone, regardless of their karma, has the ability to become suddenly enlightened in a flash of enlightened thought. That means that no matter how crappy your karma is, no matter how many bad habits you've got, in one movement, in one moment of enlightened energy, you can become enlightened. And that's because you have the Tathagata Garbha, or the embryo of the Buddha inside of you, because it's already there. Now I'm going to bring up a question at this moment, okay? And the question is this: did the Buddha and the early tradition do us a disservice by not talking more about nirvana? The reason I ask this is because I had a very interesting student come into the office the other day, and she was saying, there's this new program out there. It's a very interesting program, but what they focus on is the fact that there's a reality that belongs to all of us that is above and beyond our thinking. Okay, I'm going to stop and I'm going to start this conversation again because it's going to cut me off in exactly 20 seconds. All right, stop.